The single family home may not work, and it's clearly not for all people, especially younger people trying to buy their first home. And now also older folks trying to downsize. And where are they downsizing to? There's nowhere actually to go.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast with Rob Harter. I'm Lena LaRue, based currently in Mexico, and I'm a listener just like you who cares about the nonprofit world and the people leading it. If you're looking to learn and grow as a nonprofit leader, you're in the right place. Thanks for listening. Now, here's Rob.
This podcast is sponsored by DonorBox. DonorBox, helping you help others with the best donation forms in the business. Well, welcome back to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. I have Amy Tomasso here in the studio to talk all about a foundation that she helps run. Amy, first of all, thanks so much for joining me today.
It's great to be here, Rob.
Yeah, you bet. Well, as you know, I think you've been listening to some of my podcast episodes. I always love to start by asking a little bit about my guests and just to tell a bit of their personal story, a short version of what got you to what you're doing today. So maybe you could do that, Amy. Just tell us a bit of your story of what led you to what you're doing today with the foundation.
Absolutely. Thanks for that question. So I grew up in central Connecticut, right outside of Hartford, and my family was in the construction business. We have over 100-year-old business founded by my Italian great-grandfather, and I think that always led me to be focused on the built environment, first as a planner and then now in housing. But to be part of that business and to see the impact that the built environment has on community, and just to watch the examples, very service-oriented, of especially my grandfather and other family members, lighted up this sense that their, public service is a viable career path, and it's so important. And so I followed that into the world of urban planning, and we'll get into now with housing. But, how can one serve community was always been core to me.
That sounds like you were raised in a great family that set a good example for you. And you always gave us a little bit of that journey, but I just want to highlight for my listeners that you, as you mentioned, you studied urban studies at Stanford. You worked also in local and state government there in Vermont. You earned a master's in real estate at Harvard. I thought that's didn't even know they offered real estate at Harvard, but that's wonderful. And then now you lead this policy at a housing-focused nonprofit in Utah. Interesting journey so far. Is there something that kind of brings it all together for you, particularly as you mentioned, you're really about housing. Is there a single moment that made housing your life's work where you're like, this is what I want to do?
It's always been about community for me. As I said, that's what led me into urban and land use planning. These questions of how do we create more walkable places? How do people come together and gather in public places and spaces, and thinking through those questions. But with housing, it was working as a community planner in Vermont. And first, it was anecdotally just hearing the struggles with our community members and really starting to connect the dots of how can you have a livable community that has strong economic development and everything else if our community members can't even find housing. Of course, that's a very rural place, so that adds a challenge. But then we put out this community well-being survey, and majority of the community responded, and just reading the comments one after the next. I remember sitting in my little office reading housing. And that was a catalytic moment.
Over and over again.
Mm-hmm. Over and over. It really shifted my trajectory.
And that is an issue across the board. You're absolutely right. Mm-hmm. You may know a little bit of my background. I've worked with nonprofits for a long time, now almost 30 years. And I would say that pops up in almost every conversation. And now I'm a consultant and a coach, and I work with a lot of other nonprofit organizations. Housing continues to be one of those big issues. Not just affordable housing, that's number one, but just enough housing, period. And here in Utah, of course, where we both live, that's a big issue. But I know that a lot of states are dealing with that. And so that's a great transition into what you're doing now. You're with Ivory Innovations. And really, Ivory Innovations sits at a fascinating intersection. You're a nonprofit, number one, a social impact organization, and you're an academic center at the University of Utah. So that's an interesting tie-in. And you're actually a housing developer, because Ivory Homes is all over Utah. How do those three entities really come together, and what model has been working so well that are driving all these changes that you're making that have been really positive changes?
we're a think and do center. So as you correctly identified on our research side, we convene and share thought leaders and put out, best practices around affordable housing. And you did mention the whole spectrum of housing affordability. So from renters to home ownership, everything at all levels of income. Importantly, we work at the University of Utah inspiring the next generation of leaders. We have a very robust student internship program, one of the most competitive at the University of Utah, and we have many other student programs to really mentor them. We support entrepreneurs, both entrepreneurial people in government, but also those founding startups that are all around housing affordability and innovation. So that's through our Ivory Prize, our annual grant. And then we do build. And we do this both as the nonprofit arm of Ivory Homes, as you identified, Utah's #1 home builder for over 30 years. But not everyone knows that we actually build our own affordable housing developments ourselves through Ivory Innovations. And we're an operating foundation. So that's kind of a whole other layer to those three that you laid out. It is different, and I can get more into, what that means and how that impacts our work. But we're unique, and honestly, I will say that through the visionary work of our founders, Clark, Ivory, and his daughter, Abby, we do sit at this unique intersection, and just so much credit to them for putting these pieces together and saying, hey, we need to do more for housing affordability, and here's a way we can do it.
No, I want to dive into it a little bit because, I think it's fascinating what you're doing there at the foundation of bringing all these different entities into a real impact for the community. So your FieldWorks program, maybe start with the FieldWorks program. It really allows innovators to test breakthrough building technologies and systems on actual Ivory Innovations development sites in Utah. So it's real hands-on experience. What has surprised you most about what happens when just one maybe idea that's on paper that sounds really good actually comes through to reality on a construction site? Talk about that whole process and that journey.
We have 1,500 units, affordable housing communities in the pipeline or completed here in Utah through Ivory Innovations. And exactly, FieldWorks is our kind of streamlined process to bring our Ivory Prize winners from across the country into our developments. But the thing is, construction doesn't stop for innovation. Construction is already an industry with very small margins, especially in home building. And so, especially we hear about new housing materials and construction methodologies, panelized, modular, offsite, and we vet them, right, on paper is one thing. But to actually bring them in, we always say it's like building the plane while flying. It's building the house while trying to bring in a whole new method. And that's really challenging. One thing that is maybe a solution there is maybe piloting some of these innovations on what we call test bed sites or smaller infill projects versus trying to apply an innovation to a 200 or even 300 unit, multifamily development. Just two other things I'll mention. Community impact can matter just as much as that newest, latest, greatest, construction R&D technique. And so thinking about in all of our communities, we just built and opened a literacy community tutoring center in Lehigh on one of our affordable developments. We consider that innovation as much as bringing in panelized housing, for example. So, and then finally, the second thing is that innovation is happening not just on the construction site, but there are so many ways to innovate in housing affordability and especially prop tech, bringing in platforms like Foyer. We've brought into our developments here in Utah. That's a platform that helps renters with down payment assistance, long-term and homebuyer education. That's just one great example of we can bring that in. It's innovation. It's helping the affordability spectrum. So it's really thinking broadly too. But yeah, construction is very difficult.
This is interesting. There's an overlap with construction companies and nonprofits. You have to work with local municipalities, or you should be working with local governments, right? But builders have to. And one of the things I thought was really interesting that you bring to the table, you have what you call the little book of low-cost, high-impact housing solutions. It's like a playbook, if you will, you give to municipalities that they can just walk through it. And I think, as I understand, as I learned about this, you actually learned from cities like Austin and South Bend, Indiana, where they kind of created the Sears catalog of pre-approved house plans. Talk about that a little bit more, because I didn't know that you did that. I'm assuming that's a pretty big help to local governments to have something that's laid out, that's really clear. What is the single biggest barrier that stops more cities from adopting these proven strategies? Because I think it sounds like Austin has done a really good job, South Bend, Indiana, just as two examples, and you're trying to do the same here in Salt Lake. But yeah, what keeps people from doing this and adopting it in their city?
I really think it's this innovation mindset. It's the willingness to ask, how can we do things differently, better, and not just how can we keep them the same? Same may be working, right? But just because you've been doing it doesn't mean that it's really pushing the needle. Clearly, we have this huge housing affordability crisis. And so in those examples in Austin and South Bend, there was a champion of both of those. In Austin, council member Paige Ellis, who saw a problem, and specifically in that case around missing middle housing, which I know we'll get to, of seeing community members, family members being able to afford homes, and said, what can we do about this? In that case, it was regulatory reform. In South Bend, Tim Corcoran, the planning director there, again, saw a problem and put together solutions that were, one, pragmatic. They were all about the community, economic development, infill, affordability, not necessarily a moral argument or a different, environmental. These don't always work to bring together coalitions, as valid as they may be. And so every successful reform I've seen or innovation around housing, and the ones we cite in the little book, which by the way is free online, we just love to share solutions. So
Very cool.
you can just
Okay.
search the little
I'll
book.
put that in the show notes. Yeah.
Yep. Every reform has that champion, whether it's the public sector, sometimes it's a business or a nonprofit leader coming in. And I think having that champion can solve the political will problem, which is sometimes held up as, oh, it's really hard to change things with political will. But these messages that kind of circumvent some of the political sticky issues and get to the heart of how can our community thrive. And then whether it's using zoning reform or these tactical ways to solve it, it's really thanks to these heartful community members that are taking the charge.
That's interesting. So it sounds like really what's made it successful is a point person that really champions that. And it's typically from the community and or the city council itself, sounds like.
Could be a mayor, planning director, development director, and sometimes everyday citizens who come together, and that happens too. And every place is different how reforms happen, but like Durham, North Carolina, another place that's had great success with decreasing median home price. Citizens came together. You can actually propose land use amendments in North Carolina as a group of kind of citizen planners. So that's just another example. It doesn't always have to be someone in power. And even those elected, they're everyday people too, trying to find ways to bring solutions in.
No, that's fascinating. Well, okay, let's get into that, like reducing prices and having just a different model. I understand that you've spoken at Harvard, among other places, and you spoke around the country about changing a little bit the mindset of what kind of homes are out there. Talking about duplexes, triplexes, cottage courts. These are the type of homes that used to be really common, but they've kind of gone away. For listeners who are not familiar with some of this, why does this housing type matter as much as it does? And what policy levers actually bring it back? So it sounds like that we did it for a long time. We got away from it. You're saying this could be one of, not the only thing, but one of the solutions towards our housing issue. Tell me about more what it is, first of all, and then what has been the response so far?
I love this solution so much. So, right, let's get into what it is. Let's break it down. Middle housing. What is the middle of? So between a single family home, which is kind of the predominant home type that this country has built for 50 plus years, and then at the other end of the spectrum, larger scale apartment buildings that you see going up everywhere. And nothing wrong with those two. I mean, all homes are good. But what's in the middle of those two kind of poles? We have, like you said, duplexes, triplexes, cottage clusters. In many communities, even smaller villages, rural places, you would see an apartment over the post office or the general store. Those are all examples, kind of live work of missing middle. And it's missing in large part because of zoning and land use, policies that came up around this kind of automobile-centric post-World War II paradigm of how land was planned, and many of them were exclusionary to create these kind of suburban enclaves. There's a whole history there that's really worth exploring. But what it did was lock out these diverse housing types. And when you have diversity of housing types, you get different price points, you get different sizes, because the reality is we're all at different life stages with different incomes and needs and family sizes. And so the single family home may not work. And it's clearly not for all people, especially younger people trying to buy their first home. And now also older folks trying to downsize. And where are they downsizing to? There's nowhere actually to go. And then that locks up kind of those larger family size homes. So you can see there's just this kind of gridlock happening. Let's get to the second part, because I could go on and on all day. But what are some policy levers to bring this back? Well, it's about legalizing smaller homes on smaller lots. And so there's all kinds of reforms that can happen there. Salt Lake City has a great package that's up now called Expanding Housing Options. But fundamentally, what you need to know is that mostly across the country, only single family homes are actually legal to build. So bringing in a different mix.
Oh, fascinating.
These are all uses we want to see. Number two, on smaller lots, then streamlining the process. If you think about it, if we've only built those single family homes and apartment buildings, well, then the whole system of residential development has just been created around those two home types. So streamlining that middle path, again, Austin did it, and other cities, and then supporting developers of those smaller home types and supporting them through education, financing, the mortgage industry in this country. Again, it's a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, mostly for a single family home. There's a lot of things that need to change. Those are just a few, but luckily, this is a topic that is coming up across the country with a lot of advocates behind it, because they see that there's a need for different kinds of homes. And if you look around, they already exist. They've mostly been built probably before 1950, but it's not uncommon to see a backyard garden style home. We call it ADU, accessory dwelling unit. So I challenge you to go and try to find some missing middle homes in your neighborhood.
Exactly. That's your homework from listening to this.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay. So the idea would be having more options, going back to a little bit before 1950, where you have a diversity of options for people to find, whether it be duplex or triplex. Talk about, what's the reception been when you talk about this? Do people shoot it down? Are there people excited? What has been the regular, barriers or response in general to it?
It depends where, as many things do. But I find amongst, let's say, younger generation millennials, Gen Z, there is so much excitement around missing middle, because ultimately, missing middle is much more communal. It's not co-living per se, but it's around shared green space and walkability and these concepts. There's excitement there, also potentially more affordable. But I will say that many people in the country and in the kind of American zeitgeist still want and kind of seek for the single family home on their own patch of dirt, which I've heard, and with a car. And that's fine. I think that's okay if there's also room to build these other home types in appropriate places. What's an appropriate place for missing middle? It's probably in the city limits. We call that infill, places that have existing infrastructure and amenities. You might be able to walk to your grocery store. So, there's a time and a place for everything. And it may not make sense to build that missing middle community that might be a little more car light out in the green field, like the land that hasn't been developed yet. So it's messaging it, it's finding the right place for it.
We'll be right back. Are you looking for an easy and effective way to boost your nonprofit's donations? Well, look no further than DonorBox, the online fundraising platform that streamlines your fundraising efforts, maximizes donations, and simplifies giving for your supporters. With DonorBox, you can create beautiful donation forms, accept digital wallet payments, track donations, and send auto receipts. And the best part? There are no setup or monthly fees and no long-term contracts required. So what are you waiting for? Visit donorbox.org today to get started. That is www.donorbox.org.
All right. Well, another thing I thought was pretty interesting about what you're doing at the foundation, not only are you doing it yourself, like you're actually at the construction site building these dreams off of a paper idea into actually doing it in this case, in Utah, but you also champion and highlight other companies that are really trying to bring together construction, design, finance, policy reform. And you've got this prize, this 2026 winners were just announced, I understand, in May. Talk about the applicants that have been applying to this. Talk a little bit about the Ivory Prize and what are the trends, I guess, and the themes that you're seeing with people that are really trying to do this well with their own company.
I'll touch really quickly on the public sector side and then move into a few more private and nonprofit examples. But on the public sector side, we're seeing governments engaging a lot more with housing, even sometimes going so far as becoming quasi-developers themselves. I'll throw out Atlanta Urban Development Corporation, taking city-owned land and kind of partnering with developers on that. But then, to pivot more, we're seeing actually in the philanthropic space, like especially partnerships with community foundations, a lot of revolving loan funds, like blended funds to unlock different types of capital at scale. Again, coming out of Atlanta, the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta has a fund together, ATL, that's doing exactly that. So it's really cool to see. And then, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention modular and offsite construction and capabilities there. And it's not always just the big idea there, which is, can you build a home in a factory? But it's kind of refining that concept. So digitally coordinating factories more, bringing some AI into them. We had a nominee this year called Okibo out of New Jersey, actually, that's automating drywall finishing. So you wouldn't think, but there's a labor issue that across the country. And so can some of the parts of construction become a little bit more automated and then on site for quality control, for safety, using AI, augmented reality. We had another nominee, Trace Air, using drones and other AI-enabled site intelligence to kind of streamline parts of the process that, again, are not replacing necessarily the human component completely, but cutting time from this very old-fashioned, honestly, and onerous development process. So those are some things we've seen, on the kind of capital stack, the public sector, and then the construction design world.
That's so interesting. Well, I think what's fascinating to me about your role and the different things you've done, you've kind of sat on all sides of the table. You've been in the public sector, you've been in a government role, you've worked for the local government there in Vermont, you're also in a nonprofit role. Maybe what you could speak to my listeners, again, the majority of my listeners, as far as I can tell, are in some kind of nonprofit role or they're in a social impact organization. But what can nonprofits kind of teach government and the private sector about housing? Because I do think there's a sense that a lot of nonprofits are doing a good job when it comes to affordable housing specifically, but housing in general, but certainly the affordable side is what their maybe strength is. But also flip that around, what can nonprofits learn from governments and or the private sector that can help them in their missions when it comes to housing in general? Maybe you could speak to both because again, you've been on all sides of that table.
Absolutely. And when you describe that progression of my own career, at each step, I was driven by a curiosity and a question. Like as a local planner, I thought, it would be actually great to get some more state level guidance for how do we solve some of these local issues. Then at the state, it goes back to, okay, well, then how does this transfer locally? So I totally get it. And now I get to work. It's so amazing at more of a systems level and seeing different policy solutions. But of course, it's always, will this work in one's local community? So to answer your question, you're right. The nonprofit sector, like it can be a little bit siloed, but I think what it has done well is develop deeply affordable housing using federal low-income housing tax credits. Like that is what nonprofit developers instances across the country are set up to do. But of course, with a lot of overhead and use of federal funds, these units on a per unit cost are quite expensive. And so I think, kind of flipping the part of the question, but the nonprofit sector, like learning from the private sector in some ways to be more nimble, to take some of those innovations I mentioned and integrate those. The most innovative nonprofits, I think, are convening and capacity building. So one we've really seen through the Ivory Prize, one of our winners last year, called Grounded Solutions Network. And a national nonprofit really focused on community land trusts, shared equity home ownership. And so through doing that, they've raised a fund that is basically converting rentals into home ownership opportunities over a series of years. And then they've also been able to kind of train different community land trusts across different cities. That's a wonderful role that, government can't really step out of its geographic location if we're talking state or city in many ways, to go across the country. And right, like what entity is really equipped to do that? And the private sector isn't really going to play in that space either. And so I think, and the National Housing Crisis Task Force put out a community foundation playbook too around how to be a convener, and especially really explaining like, if you're place-based, what resources already exist in that area? What funds are there? Often there are different nonprofits doing amazing things, but it's communicating amongst them and collaborating. And so I would say that. And again, we're an operating foundation at Ivory Innovations. Only 3-ish% of foundations are actually operating foundations. We're directly operating our own charitable purposes. So that's building affordable homes and doing our housing innovation research and our programs. So that's kind of another really unique model where we're taking these lessons learned from our home builder parent, the company, which is so fortunate, and getting to apply them in a very mission-driven way as well.
Well, you make a good distinction because I've had a lot of foundations on the show, and you're right. A lot of foundations just fund other nonprofits or fund other great organizations that are doing really good work, whereas you're actually an operating foundation. And that is a good distinction, and that makes it just probably more real for you. You're really on that ground level of what you're trying to implement, not just supporting it across the board. Well, another thing I think it's good that I would like you to kind of speak to, because you've already made reference to it a couple of times. You participated in the National Housing Supply Summit and the National Housing Crisis Task Force, which I'm glad, by the way, that there's something like that people are talking about these issues at a national level, right? Because it is a huge issue and it's affecting so many people. Talk about what should nonprofit leaders know about the housing space when it comes to positioning their organizations, particularly those that are focused on affordable housing. But I'm thinking like other nonprofits. In fact, the one I led most recently, even though we didn't deal directly with housing per se, we dealt with a food pantry, food insecurity, financial insecurity. And so it all ties together. For my listeners who are leading nonprofit organizations or maybe on the board for a nonprofit, what would you recommend from what you're learning at the national level that they can do at their local level?
So again, for community foundations, those doing more place-based work, you really need a housing strategy at this point, I think. And there are a lot of resources out there, whether that's a full-time position or just convening with organizations like ours that exist to help set policy agendas to kind of feed innovations and create this ripple effect. But let's start with some key questions, like what are the housing needs in your community? And could a different nonprofit even fund that kind of a study to understand, are you looking for more homeownership opportunities for families or for first-time home buyers, or for what demographic, what level, how many homes do you even need? Like many places don't have an answer to that question. And so it's planning and building for that uncertain goal. And so you need to know what you're going towards. And so there's granting opportunities there too, right? What nonprofits are playing in this space and are they talking? And that's not necessarily a bad thing if they're not, but maybe there isn't the capacity there or the convening power. So can a nonprofit serve in that role if you have a background more in convening and capacity building and dot connecting? And so again, I mentioned this National Housing Crisis Task Force Community Foundation Pro Housing Handbook, and they recommend, one role of other nonprofits is to be a one-stop shop, in their words, for developers and other nonprofits to learn about, apply for, receive financial support, like even just aggregating what are all the funding streams out there for more affordable housing. To stick with the funding conversation a bit more, something we're keenly interested in at Ivory Innovations is to inspire other funders and philanthropists to shift more into housing, and to do so in creative ways, because there are investment vehicles that are maybe outside the traditional grant making purview. that could be a bit more catalytic right now because we're seeing such a huge crisis. So something we see a lot is a need for like construction loan guarantees to fill gaps where projects are getting stalled and otherwise would not go through, or like I mentioned, the Atlanta Go ATL, fund. And there are these kind of revolving philanthropic to nonprofit community foundation funds that are helping to either acquire and preserve affordable homes or build new ones. And so there's opportunities there. But I think, again, there are leaders. Arnold Ventures is an amazing national capacity builder, and in Colorado is very fortunate to have like a very strong foundation nonprofit space with Gary Community Ventures kind of leading that conversation that can help really think around this housing strategy. And so it's like you don't have to do it alone. We're out here doing this work, but having a strategy is really important.
Yeah. Well, another thing I wanted to highlight for my listeners is that you really are invested in this next generation, inspiring students to get excited about this, come up with ways that they can be involved, even if that's not their long-term career. And you have this thing called Hack a House Competition. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, the student associate program at Ivory Innovations. And if a young person is listening to this podcast and is like, I kind of want to use my innovation, personality, or just their interest in the housing issue and wants to go into it, talk about that Hack a House competition, number one, and then would you recommend for them to do? Like, how can they get involved with what you're doing and or nationally?
Absolutely. So yes, if you're a student, do Hack a House. It's our annual 24-hour hackathon. It is. And we do that virtually and also in person at the University of Utah. So we have students from all over the country, and we send out at noon on a Friday in September 3 prompts across construction, design, policy, and finance. And then it's incredible. We bring experts from around the country virtually to meet with students and just answer their questions as they shape their solutions to these prompts across those areas. And then the next day they pitch again to national experts, and then there's winners with cash prize. And then they come to our Ivory Prize Summit, our annual celebration of our innovators, and do a live pitch for the grand prize. So it's a great way to both practice, it's all about mentoring, also the presentation and all of that is so important. We love working with our students, but then also kind of creating these housing ideas. And there are tons of resources out there. I would say, don't get overwhelmed. Housing can be really complex. It is. Housing policy is probably needlessly complex, but there's great podcasts. There's the UCLA Housing Voice from Shane Phillips. There's books, Fixer Upper is a favorite by Jenny Schuetz, and Escaping the Housing Trap is another one from Strong Towns, and the Missing Middle Housing book by Dan Perolek. Those are some of my favorites. And so it's a long journey. And then within that, a student may love finance, may love construction, may love the nonprofit side of things. And there's a path there. So I would say don't get overwhelmed by trying to solve the whole crisis overnight.
Yeah, no, there's so many elements to it. Well, again, for my listeners, we're going to have a lot of different links in our show notes like we do with most of our podcast episodes, but there'll be a lot on what Amy is talking about. And if you have an interest, if you're listening to this and you have a real interest in figuring out how do I help solve this housing issue in my community, maybe the national issue is just too big and just start locally, right? Where you live in your city or maybe your state, there's going to be some great resources you can look into. But it's such an interesting conversation. Again, I'm really glad to see what Ivory is doing because I think it's a unique and it seems like a sustainable solution because it's a combination, right, of a company that we talked about. Plus you've got that tie with the University of Utah, and then you're doing things, on this really innovative way, but you're doing it hands-on. You're an operational foundation. That is a unique combination. There's not many foundations I've run across that do all three of those pieces. So again, just an interesting conversation. Amy, thank you for being on the show today. How can people, if they want to learn a little bit more about Ivory Innovations and you, maybe connect with you and or the organization, where would you send them?
Absolutely. Ivoryinnovations.org is our website, and there you'll find our little book of housing solutions, which we are, by the way, reprinting for this fall, and that's free online too. And we have our Ivory Prize Summit, which I mentioned, but it's our free annual summit to bring all our innovators together and to share what they've done and how other communities can adopt those funds or policy reforms or whatnot, technology solutions. This year it's in Tempe, Arizona on October 14th, Arizona State University. And it's also live streamed. Everything we do, we try
Oh,
to
that's
bring
nice.
it to the
Good.
public, right? Because this is all about shining light on solutions and scaling them out and not just holding the information close to our chest and sure, using Utah as a laboratory for some of the innovations, but how can we share them out? So you'll find all our work there. We post a lot, following us on LinkedIn, but that's a great place to kind of just sign up for our newsletter. And then, of course, I will also say our Ivory Prize is our annual grant. So if you work in housing or you know of an innovator, that nomination window opens in September. Again, you'll find that on our website. And we love when we scour, the world every year for the best housing innovations, but we love when you can self-nominate too, because it's like you're really vested in your innovation. And we love connecting and learning, what are you doing in your community? How are you working on the housing problem? So say Ivory Prize and you may win. You may be our next innovator.
Never know. That's right. Well, that's a great point. I'll make sure that's in the show notes too. So yeah, if you're listening and you have a great idea and you know somebody who's really turning the dial on the housing affordability issue or just the housing issue in general, or if you are doing something, your organization is that, like you said, you could just self-nominate, or nominate your organization.
Exactly.
I think it's not a bad idea because at the end of the day, at the very least, you'll get connected with Ivory Innovations. They can learn a little bit more about what you're doing. So yeah, anyway, love it. And again, it's such an important issue. As we started today, it is affecting, I feel like, everybody at every economic level. So I'm glad there's really innovative things going on that Ivory is involved with. So once again, Amy, thanks so much for being on the show. It's a great conversation today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Hey friends, well, I wanted you to know that this podcast can be found on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, Google Podcasts, and wherever you listen to other podcasts. I also want to encourage you to like, subscribe, and share this podcast with others. This will actually help us get this great content out to more nonprofit leaders just like you. You can also join the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast community. Find other resources and interviews of past guests all on my website, nonprofitleadershippodcast.org. Well, thanks again for listening, and until next time, keep making your world better. This podcast is sponsored by DonorBox. DonorBox, helping you help others with the best donation forms in the business.